Welcome back to Third Culture Convos, the podcast where we explore the intricacies of growing up in multiple cultures and bridging the gaps between them. In today's episode, we're trying something a little different. We'll present a fictional debate between two characters with opposing views on a thought-provoking question. Can one truly understand a culture without being a part of it or growing up inside it? As Third Culture kids, this topic is near and dear to our hearts, so join us as we navigate this captivating conversation, examining the merits of each argument and delving into the complexities of cultural understanding. Let's dive right into the debate and see what's inside that we can uncover. So Rashid, I'm going to kick off this debate, all right? By these two fictional characters, Dr. Amelia Hart and Dr. Rajesh Nair, all right? Okay. Opening statements first. Dr. Amelia Hart. Thank you. I believe that it's possible to truly understand a culture without being part of it or growing up in it. In my experience as an anthropologist, I have witnessed individuals from different cultural backgrounds immerse themselves in new cultures, learn the language, customs, and traditions, and develop a deep appreciation and understanding of the culture. Through empathy, open-mindedness, and a genuine willingness to learn, one can gain profound insights into any culture. Dr. Rajesh Nair responds, I appreciate your perspective, Dr. Hart, but I must respectfully disagree. Cultural understanding goes beyond learning the language, customs, and traditions. It involves being raised in the culture, experiencing the subtle nuances, and understanding the underlying values and belief systems. These are things that can only be truly grasped by someone who has lived within the culture since childhood. No matter how open-minded or empathetic one might be, there will always be a level of understanding that remains out of reach for outsiders. Dr. Amelia Hart responds, I understand your point, Dr. Nair, but I would like to emphasize the importance of immersion and adaptation. When individuals immerse themselves in a culture for an extended period, they can develop a deep understanding of its intricacies. They may not have experienced every aspect of the culture since childhood, but their commitment to learning and engaging with locals can lead to a level of understanding that rivals that of someone who was raised within that culture. Dr. Rajesh Nair responds, Dr. Hart, while immersion and adaptation are certainly important, I believe that there is a distinct difference between understanding a culture and truly experiencing it. Growing up in a culture shapes an individual's thoughts, emotions, and reactions in ways that can never be replicated by someone who has only observed or studied the culture. One may learn to appreciate and respect a culture from the outside, but the deep emotional connection and inherent understanding that comes from being part of that culture cannot be duplicated. Dr. Amelia Hart responds, I see where you're coming from, Dr. Nair, but I think it's important to acknowledge that cultures are not static. They evolve and change over time, influenced by internal factors and external interactions. An individual who is raised within a culture may find that their understanding of it becomes outdated or incomplete over time, while someone who is dedicated to learning about and engaging with the culture on an ongoing basis may develop a more current and comprehensive understanding. And Dr. Rajesh Nair responds, that's a valid point, Dr. Hart, but I still maintain that there is a core understanding of a culture that can only be obtained by those who have been a part of it from the beginning. The emotional, psychological, and experiential connections that come from being raised within a culture form the foundation for a deeper level of understanding that cannot be acquired through observation or study alone. Thank you for this argument, and I'm looking forward to learning more about it. Rashid,
Yeah.
who are you with? Who are you with? Are you with Dr. Amelia? Or are you with Dr. Rajesh?
Am I allowed to be on the fence?
No, I think you got to pick a side, man. And then maybe at the end of the conversation, you can change your mind. But I think you got to pick a side.
So my initial impulse is to agree with Dr. Rajesh because of the fact that I agree in the sense that you can only truly understand a culture unless you've actually grown up within it and be a part of that culture instead of coming from the outside and putting yourself into it. It's a similar argument that I've made in the past with friends of mine where I used to get into a lot of polemic arguments, religious polemic arguments. I mean, at first they would be like, which one's the right religion? When I'm like, I don't deal with that crap. Like, religion is religion and it speaks to everyone in different ways, and each religion speaks differently to different people. It's not, I don't believe in one big true religion. Thunderbolt? I don't know, but whatever. And that's also me because I grew up within various religious traditions. But my argument within that sphere was, in order to fully understand what a religion says about itself, what its holy book says about itself, and in this case, how a culture perceives itself and perceives its people and its purpose and its traditions and its shared history amongst its people, you have to understand the subtle nuances of that culture. And in order to be able to do that, you really have to be born with it and basically live within that culture from when you're born as a baby. And then the thing is, we pick up so many things by osmosis just by being in an atmosphere, in a general place, observing the adults, the elders, and subtle phrases in a different language and that kind of stuff. So for I was reading something yesterday and it was freaking hilarious because it was Egyptian idioms and how, like, they basically did it where it was a an employee putting in the letter of resignation, but it was the English translations of Egyptian sayings. And they're stupid in English, but they make sense in Egyptian. So I had to research the actual phrases in Arabic because
So
I actually don't know them.
like the literal translations
The literal
don't make sense.
translations, like, so
Yeah,
for
and with
example, one
Arabic,
is
there's
like,
plenty of those. Yeah.
there's one that was like, there's people living in our neck, and it's just, what the hell does that mean? Then you read it in Arabic, you're like, oh, okay, makes sense. Like, it's basically saying that I have to provide for people. Come on, man, there's people like around my neck type of thing, right?
Yeah, on my neck.
Exactly. So, and then, so the thing is, that's one of those things where you won't actually understand what that means unless you actually live in that culture from when you're a child and hear it over and over again in different context, in the context in which it's used. And then you can really understand what's going on. Whereas if you're coming in from the outside, you have to sit there, you hear that, you're like, what the hell does that mean? For example, actually, I'm going to have to ask this of my Greek friends. There's one thing where the equivalent of in the Egyptian, where like the door can fit a camel, as in get out of here.
Yeah.
And then there's an equivalent in Greek, apparently, where it basically says, hit the road, the dogs are tied. So you're not going to the road is safe. You need to leave now. You're no longer
Oh,
welcome, type of
we've
thing.
tied up the dogs.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
okay.
stray dogs are not
I
going
would even in English, right? Hit the road is
Yeah.
you translate that into Arabic. You're like, why would you want to hit the road?
Yeah.
Like,
Hit the pavement or
what does
whatever
that
it is.
even
Yeah.
mean? And like, oh no, it means, but you could, yeah,
Kill two birds with one stone. Why are you killing birds? What did they ever do
yeah. What are you
except from
trying to
shit
do
on your
here?
window?
And there's plenty of films of right like of there's plenty of films of taking the person from the outside of the country and then bringing
Yeah.
them into that country. But I think what the sort of the argument that Dr. Rajesh is making is that is your argument. So you're leaning in towards his direction in terms of
Yeah.
being like you're not going to know that. And but I think what Dr. Amelia is saying is that you can learn it. Like you can go and you can learn it. You spend a bit of time, right? Like even now you just told like you just shared a an idiom or a metaphor and then we were able to know it and so now I know it. And like how can I appreciate the cultural sort of nuance in it from day one? Probably not. But and I think this is probably where Dr. Amelia's point is the strongest and might actually what actually made me stop and think was the nature of cultures changing over time. So when you grow up in a culture, you have no other reference point outside of that culture. So it's normal. So it's normal with, and you can't reference it against something else, unless of course you're third culture and you've traveled a bunch, like growing up. And so then you're like, oh wow, they do it this way here, then they do it this way here. And very early on, you get all of these. There's not only one way, even though to you, there's only one way to grow up, which is to travel a lot. You can't imagine what it would be like to not be traveling a lot when you're growing up. And so the changing over time bit, that a culture changes over time. If you grew up in only the one culture, you may not appreciate the changes that it makes over time, you could be stuck in the past in terms of the understanding of your culture, especially as 20, 30, 40 years, it may change dramatically.
Well, the best example I can illustrate for that would be, for example, people like my parents' generation, for example, who left the Middle East and came to Canada and really never went back often enough to understand the changes that happened. Excellent. But what ends up happening is they still think of life back in the old country as it was when they left. And then there was always this thing where they always compare the lifestyle in Canada, for example, and say how it's so bad. It's not like this back home. And I'm like, you do realize things have changed. It, like, when my father left Nablus after the 67 war, after the 6-Day War, you honestly believe that in 2023, Nablus is the same city? It's not. It's changed. Historically, Nablus is a conservative city. It probably still is. But there's a lot of changes that would have happened that he doesn't know about, that the youth are probably doing, that he probably would make his head explode.
Yeah, the changing nature of a place.
Yeah. And that's related to what the anthropologist Amelia would be saying, in that the evolution of cultures and realities is influenced by different factors. And one of those factors obviously would be factors from the outside, of outside cultures leaving an imprint on your culture. But the thing is, if you're living within that over time, you won't realize necessarily what's actually been changed. Or if you're, so let's say in a hypothetical fantasy world, I had a child and my child grew up in this evolving culture that I just didn't realize it ended up changing and evolving, because why would I notice that? I'm an adult, I have other things to worry about. But this child is born into the differences that I never realized. And you're like, what's wrong with these stupid kids these days? All the time, all the generation, what's wrong with these stupid, back in my day, we did X, Y, Z. And now these kids are like doing whatever. It's things have changed, like video games, for example. It's one of the things that changes the culture of video games. Like for me, growing up, I was at the beginning of video games. So I remember, I have a vague recollection of the Atari system and then the transition into the original Nintendo. I'm old.
No, but this is the birth of video gaming. Like, video gaming as we know it, and it's only our generation. I'm right behind you, so I'm right in the Nintendo. Like, I was playing Nintendo when I was 5 years old, and the birth of is a good example, because the birth of the video gaming system, of that, if you were around before that, it's foreign to you, and man, all the kids are playing video games these days. But my attitude with my kids to video games is like totally different from, let's say, my parents' attitude, or people that grew up without video games. Because they didn't exist. Maybe not necessarily because like they existed, but you didn't have access to them is one thing, but they didn't exist. And so then when they do exist, and you get the sort of generations to catch up, and so now I'm like, oh yeah, you could totally play video games. There's nothing, like, my attitude towards video games is not that like they're all bad, therefore he shouldn't be playing them, and he's sitting at home playing video games all day. There is a limit, like almost everything. But my initial thing is in regards to that, like that.
Do you think for that is for like the generation that started with video games? Let's just stick with this for a few minutes. They learned how to police themselves because they went from living a lifestyle where it's just get our bikes, go out and play, ride your bikes to the valley and do stupid shit as a kid and whatever it is type of thing. Then these video games come out and you play. But the thing is that you're not used to doing it from when you're a younger age, because a lot of these people, let's just say that the video games came out and they were 10 or 11. So before that, they were used to playing outside all the time, doing stuff outside. Their attention span probably gets so low to the point where I don't want to do this anymore. Let's go back outside. So they learned how to police themselves over time. But then our generation with our kids, a lot of those kids, I'm just going to say not everyone, but a lot of those kids started with an iPad in their face. So they don't know that difference between being outside and then coming in playing and then getting bored of it and going back out. Everything that they know is electronic. It's all digital. It's this. So then the parents have to learn how to police that. And that's where the limits come into play. So that's the difference, I would say, in terms of an evolution of a part of a cultural evolution, in the sense of how people as kids spend their time. But then there's other things too. An old roommate of mine, her father's gone back to Vietnam for the first time in 20 plus years. And Vietnam has changed a lot in 20 years.
Yeah.
And so He's posting stuff on Facebook. He does street photography and all that, just like amateur street photography. And just reading what he says about how things have changed since he was there last. Part of it is another culture shock because you left that country, you were born and raised in that country, but you left under different pretenses. So for him, he would have left when there's a lot of upheaval happening in Vietnam. Now he goes back to Vietnam, it's fairly stable, but now what's happening in Vietnam, for example, there's a lot of outside influence from Russian investment. So now like the Russians are really heavily influencing what's happening in Vietnam in terms of business and economy and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, even still, even if you were born somewhere, you grow up there, you leave for a certain amount of time and you go back, it's almost like you are that person the anthropologist is talking about, because now you're re-immersing yourself in a culture that you thought you knew, but now it's changed. And you have to learn everything all over again.
But can you? So the question, this is what our original debate was, is that can you learn it after having been away from it for that long? Is that even possible? Because now you're on Dr. Amelia's side. Like well, now you're arguing for her.
Here's the thing, because now it's in a sense, so it's almost for me, it is a hybrid, because to understand nuances and subtleties of a culture, I feel like you have to be born in that culture and live there long enough. But then to be able to understand and appreciate the culture and understand its evolution, I think it's easier coming from the outside in because you have a different reference point to compare it to. So you're coming from somewhere else, you're coming into this culture, you already have this bias of something else that exists. And now you're coming in and you're observing what this new culture is that you're sitting within. And you're like, okay, so they do this like this, but on the other side, they do this like that type of thing. It's a tough debate because they both have merit. Both arguments have their own merit. But the thing is that as we know, life is not static. Experiences are not static. Everything is in constant flux. So I can't stick to one side because I can see both.
Yeah, but you have to choose. There's no learning if you don't choose. You got to choose. You could change your mind. You could choose A today and B tomorrow. And you could totally change, but you got to choose. That's what makes it fun. And the ability
I know, but there's so many topics. There's so many topics within it that you can say he's right and she's right.
Exactly. But you got to choose. Right? And the subtlety.
Well, which one do you?
This ties to the conversation. Okay. I had initially, just like you, I was pretty solid in Dr. Rajesh's court. I was like, yo, there's only way you could truly understand it. And for the same arguments that you said, you got to be a part of it. There's some subtleties that you're not going to understand. You can't just come in and bring it. But then Dr. Amelia's points, and as I sat and thought about it, and then even now your points that you just mentioned, which was like when you go back, you're leading with a new culture and having the subtle understandings from the old culture that you were a part of, that now you've taken a break from, and then you come back, actually hinders your ability to understand the new culture as is, as opposed to helps you understand it, possibly. And so I'm now more and more surprisingly, in Dr. Amelia's corner. Admittedly, I'm very surprised that I think, because I was pretty sure, I was pretty like, yeah, man, you got to know it. And maybe the reason why I say that also is a sense of when you're part of a club, like there's a feeling that like I'm part of the club. And so there's an exclusivity that comes from being part of a club, and that actually strokes your ego because I'm a part of that club and I can draw a differentiation between me and someone. So there's a little bit of ego that comes into play by being an exclusive member. Exclusive membership. Everybody loves exclusive membership. Okay, I'm a member. And so I think that I initially lent towards Dr. Rajesh because my ego appreciated the exclusivity of that understanding, because then only I could understand, or me and my people could understand, like Arab culture, as an example.
See, the thing is that, but here's the thing that swings me back to Dr. Rajesh would be something that you're getting into right now. How many times have you had to try and explain, just say a particular word in Arabic that doesn't necessarily exist in English to a non-Arabic speaker, for them to understand what that word actually means? Because the thing is, we talk about nuances again, could be one word in use various contexts. I spend a lot of my time on Google Translate because something pops in my head, and usually it's like languages related to Arabic or French, Spanish, Greek, whatever it is. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what this word means. And I type in the word, and then I get a list of different translations. And I'm like, what the hell? Like, how can it have all these different translations for this one same word? So the
Meaning,
thing for me is that in the sense that with what Dr. Rajesh would be saying is that you don't fully understand a culture unless you are a part of that culture, because then you can understand the subtleties of this one particular word that, for example, like that would give you some kind of comfort, let's just say. Like there are times when I hear Arabic and it gives me some kind of comfort because it reminds me of my childhood. Okay, fine. And then certain phrases and certain words reminds me of a certain situation or a certain individual, whatever it is. So for me, that's a part of the tipping point when it comes to going onto Rajesh's side, because of the fact that there are those subtle nuances that, yeah, you could try and immerse yourself into a culture and it could be explained to you what this word means in this context and how it matters. But unless you have understood this from when you're a child, I don't feel like you'll fully grasp the actual meaning of it, if that makes any sense.
I hear you. But what I'm saying, and what I'm saying on top of that, is that literally the feeling that you get, let's say the feeling of satisfaction that you get in understanding it, like from the inside, without having needing it to be explained to you, is the very thing that prevents you from accepting Dr. Amelia's
Yes.
position.
Yeah.
But that feeling of satisfaction, what I'm positing is that the feeling of satisfaction serves your ego and not necessarily the reality or the objective reality of knowing the culture. Because I want to say, similar to supporting a sports team, right? Like if you have like a life, like you're a Jays fan and you're a Blue Jays fan, you're a diehard Blue Jays fan, you're a part of the group, and then somebody comes and moves to Toronto and the Blue Jays are in the World Series, and then there's a bandwagon of supporters that join, and you go, yeah, but you guys aren't real supporters, you're bandwagon supporters. And that argument
I've
serves
been there.
your
I've done that
ego.
many a times.
Of course you have. And which is why it's relative. And so that argument actually serves your ego, because and here's where I would argue, like they're just as much as a fan as you are, even if they are just bandwagon fans. Right?
It's similar to, so for example, in terms of football, supporting Liverpool, and Liverpool has become a huge club in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Liverpool within itself is not necessarily a huge city in a sense, like its population is like 400,000 people, whatever, like the actual city of Liverpool. But there is this pervading theme within local Liverpool supporters as well in Liverpool who are like, they're annoyed about the tourist fan who comes, buys tickets for stupid prices, wants to sit low in Anfield and isn't watching the game. They have their phone out, they're recording what's going on. And they're like, you're not true fans. When I was in my teens, I was in the cop and I was singing my freaking heart out and blah blah blah. And all like, so I'm on the flip side of what you just described as being like, consider myself as a diehard Jays fan. I grew up in a city. I'm from there. I've watched all the bullshit and I watched all the winning. And the same thing could be, and then I'm that person on the other side when it comes to Liverpool, but it's just, yeah, but you never know. I may never get there. You're lucky to live there and you can get to a match. I've been to one and I don't think I'll ever get to one ever again in my life, which is, for me, it's unfortunate, but whatever. But I can understand that part of it. But now we're going into this concept of like tribalism.
Yeah, I would call it a hierarchy of cultural understanding. Like, and it is very much so like that. And I think it's astute that you brought up that word, and that's where Dr. kind of Rajesh comes into play. Is like, where do you draw the line between understanding it, but then also saying that you can't understand it because you're not in the group, because I have the privileged position of being in the group. And so I can tell you that you're not going to get it because I'm in it. Versus Dr. Amelia being like, if I sat and I tried and I really came at it with an open understanding, open dialogue, like open ears, open hearts, open minds, that I can.
See, here's the thing. So one of the things that I find as well when it comes to really understanding a culture and its reality and how it perceives itself, excuse me, this concept of generational trauma. So you being born and growing up within a specific culture, you naturally take on the historical trauma of this culture. It's historical events and events that would have been traumatic or events that would have been considered a success, for example. And if you're just putting yourself into the culture without really knowing those events or having experienced those events through the elders, quote unquote, again, there's a barrier there to really fully understand what the culture is, right? Because you always hear there's always from the older generation that talks about whatever happened this time and whatever happened that time, or there was war and we had to hide. And then you hear these stories as a kid, and then it starts to you start to get this emotional attachment to these events that you never experienced yourself. I'll give you an example. There is a BBC documentary that I started watching recently, and it's called The Holy Land in Us. And what it is, it's British Jews and British Palestinians. And what they're basically doing is they're retracing what happened to their families after leading up to and after the war of Israel's independence. So you have this one person, he's a barrister slash he's basically a TV judge in England. So his family originally was from Poland. They ended up settling in London. So his family is on the Jewish side. And there are a few different families on the Palestinian side. This one girl, for example, her ancestors were basically the guardians, the custodians of a few different villages in the Galilee. And her one great great grandfather was well documented in what his major purpose for a long time when he was running the Galilee was to protect the three religious communities from the Ottomans and from like thieves on the trade routes and all that kind of stuff. The thing for them is that they have a certain trauma related to their family's experiences, despite the fact of not living where their families came from. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that they're coming from the outside into a culture because and they have the hybrid of that culture being explained to them. And like they can still pick up those emotions related to events that happened in the past that were highly traumatic to people. So obviously on the Jewish side, this individual's family, his grandparents, and part of his family ended up surviving Auschwitz just by chance because they were sent to Auschwitz just as the war was ending. And then the people who fled places like Deir Yassin, for example, from the massacre in Deir Yassin, and others who just ended up in Jordan somehow as refugees from the Palestinian side, ended up in England and all that kind of stuff. So there's even an element where if you don't necessarily live in a specific geographic location, you can still pick up those nuances and those traumatic events in the past from the elders, quote unquote. And again, that comes down to language because a lot of that stuff is passed down in the family's perceived mother tongue. So you always hear the stories in Arabic, and I'm like, oh, like for me to hear it in Arabic makes more sense than hearing it in English. Let's just say.
And maybe that's also one of those big barriers to Amelia's decision, or like a caveat to Amelia's decision, where it's you need to learn the language first in order to learn the culture, right? There's no separating language and culture when it comes to learning about a group of people. And by being born in a culture, you learn the language quite fast, obviously, because that's the language that you learn. And actually, this is why it's also interesting when some people grow up bilingual or trilingual even. And that gives them the ability to build bridges between cultures because they could see that connection way more. But then they would probably also be in Dr. Amelia's side on this one. And at least this is actually where I'm finally landing, which is on Dr. Amelia's side. I'm with her in the sense that knowing different languages and knowing different languages has allowed me to learn different cultures, but also cultures that I don't like, that I'm not immersed in, and I don't necessarily know their language. I can at least understand the limits of my knowing. But for the cultures that I do know, if I did learn the language, like if I really did like to sit down and took the time and to learn the language, I would have a key into and immerse myself in the culture. I would have a key into a cultural understanding that I could get it. Like I believe that I could get it, that I could understand that culture. Having with my evidence being my own life and having, let's say, the keys to different cultures. So I have the keys to an English culture, the keys to an Arabic culture. So I've been able to understand those things, even though I grew up in both those cultures. So it's still maybe learning at 35 or 37 or 40 or 45 or 50 is different from learning at 5 and 10 and 15. But you do have more nuance to understand at 40, 45, 50 than you do at 5 and 10. And so it's a different kind of knowing.
It's almost like being a jack of all trades in a sense. Did it think for me when it comes to really understanding a culture is language is the biggest, it's the largest factor in my mind. And in terms of how language is stored in your brain, the language center has basically it's almost 90% of your language center is solely for the purpose of your mother tongue. So all the information, all the data, all of the understanding of grammar, all that stuff is like 90% of your language center. The final 10% is everything else that you learn outside of that. So let's just say that you are fluent in 5 languages. And if English is your mother tongue, it takes up 90% of your language center. The 10% will be the other 4 languages, which is why a lot of people end up getting mixed up between languages when or they can pop into a language quicker than they normally would. So for example, I find when I'm in a non-English speaking part of the world, my non-English languages pop up really fast because now my brain is thinking non-English. And then like words that I didn't even know that I knew end up popping up in Arabic, for example. I'm like, where the hell did that word come from? Or Greek. I'm like, I don't know. And then I start making those connections between the different languages. But I feel like just because of the nature of language and how language is learned, it still remains a hindrance to fully understanding a culture that you immerse yourself into, because you can learn what the nuances are of a language. You can learn what people might mean in different situations, but I still feel like there will always be a wall between you and being able to fully understand what that person who was born in that culture actually fully understands.
So you're with Dr. Raja still. All right.
And a lot of it is based on language. It's not necessarily based on understanding the society as a whole, because I can understand Dr. Amelia's understanding when it comes to understanding the greater culture and society. But for me, a lot of it comes down to the emotional aspect of being in a culture. And a lot of it comes from language.
I think I'm going to shoot this now back to our listener. We just had a very interesting discussion about, and I'd like you to choose. I'd like you to choose. Are you with Dr. Rajas's argument, or are you with Dr. Amelia's argument? Which one do you, and you got to pick. And I know you want to see especially as a third culture kid, you want to see the merit in both sides and you want to wishy-wash in the middle. But I will put you in a point where you have to choose only just for now, and you're free to change your mind. In closing, I want to thank you all for tuning into this unique episode of Third Culture Convos, where we explored this fictional debate between Dr. Rajesh and Dr. Amelia on whether you can truly understand a culture without being a part of it or growing up in it. I hope that this conversation sparked some thought and reflection on your own experiences and perspectives as third culture kids. And let us know in the comments which one do you chose, and did you change your mind as a result of this conversation? Remember, our goal is to bridge cultural gaps and build connections between people from all walks of life. As always, please, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this debate and your own experiences with cultural understanding. Don't forget to follow us on social media and share your thoughts with the Third Culture Convos community. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and share with your friends and family. Join us next time for another engaging conversation on the nuances and challenges of growing up in multiple cultures. And until then, take care and keep exploring the beautiful complexities that make our world so diverse and connected. Peace, peace.